The ritual began with the wine. It was always the same bottle, a Cabernet Sauvignon from the valley we visited on our last anniversary, and its deep crimson color held the memory of her laughter. I poured 2 glasses with a steady hand, the liquid whispering against the crystal. 1 glass I placed at my own setting, the other I carried to the empty chair across from me, its polished wood gleaming under the soft light of the chandelier. The gesture was not one of remembrance, but of invocation, a silent summons to a ghost I refused to release. The table itself was an altar, set for 3 with a precision that bordered on obsession. The silverware, polished to a mirror shine, was aligned with geometric perfection beside the fine china we had received as a wedding gift. A single, perfect white rose sat in a slender vase at the center, its petals still tight, its fragrance a subtle counterpoint to the aroma of the roast cooling in the kitchen. The third place setting was identical to the others, a complete and flawless tribute to the woman who was both absent and overwhelmingly present. When the doorbell chimed, its sound was not an interruption, but a cue, the next step in a carefully orchestrated performance. My heart did not quicken. It beat with the steady, metronomic rhythm of a ceremony that had become familiar over the past few months. I rose from my chair without haste, my movements fluid and deliberate as I walked through the silent hall to the front door. There was no anxiety in my anticipation, only the cold, clear focus of a director about to welcome the final actor onto the stage. She stood on the threshold, her expression a practiced blend of empathy and professionalism that I knew was now a facade. The grief consultant passed over the threshold into my home, her movements imbued with a quiet familiarity that she had earned over many weeks. She hung her light coat on the hook without being asked, her presence no longer that of an outsider, but of a willing participant in the strange liturgy of my sorrow. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw not pity, but a dark, knowing understanding. At the table, silence reigned, broken only by the faint, rhythmic clink of a fork against a plate. I watched her as she ate, her movements graceful and measured, a study in quiet composure. She did not look at the empty chair beside her, nor at the full plate of food that sat before it, yet her awareness of them was a palpable force in the room. She understood the rules of this space without a single word of instruction ever having been spoken between us, and her adherence to them was flawless. Between us, the third plate sat untouched but for the steam rising from its contents. A perfectly seared steak, its center a warm pink, sat beside a mound of asparagus drizzled with hollandaise sauce. It was her favorite meal, prepared exactly as she liked it, and the aroma filled the space between us, more real than any memory. This meal was not a tribute. It was an anchor, a tangible offering designed to hold her spirit fast to the chair, to compel her presence at our nightly séance. The consultant's acceptance of this was the most crucial part of the ritual. Her composure was absolute, a perfect mirror to my own, and it validated the entire grotesque tableau. She ate her food, participated in the silence, and in doing so, she gave my delusion form and breath, transforming a private madness into a shared reality. She was not merely a witness to my grief. She had become its essential component, the living vessel that made the ceremony complete. The air in the dining room was thick, not with sorrow, but with the dense weight of our unspoken agreement. The sharp edges of my loss had been carefully sculpted into this bizarre weekly performance, a ritual that kept the wound open and bleeding. We were not mourning a death, we were actively sustaining a presence, keeping her ghost tethered to the world through wine and food and a shared profound silence. She, the consultant hired to guide me through my grief, had instead become my high priestess in a religion of my own making. My life before her arrival was a fractured mosaic of memory, a collection of brilliant, painful shards. I would be paralyzed by the sudden recollection of my wife's laugh echoing from the walls of our sun-drenched kitchen, a sound so vivid it felt like she was in the next room. I could feel the phantom pressure of her hand on the small of my back as we danced in the living room, the memory so potent it made my muscles ache with longing. These flashes of joy were immediately followed by the searing images of screeching tires, the blinding glare of headlights, and the sterile, unforgiving white of the hospital room that became her last. The transition from vibrant life to the profound, hollow silence of the morgue was a wound that refused to scab over, tearing open with every remembered smile. The grief consultant entered this desolate landscape like a figure from a manual, a pre-packaged solution to an unquantifiable void. Her name was a detail I barely registered at first. She was simply a function, a professional presence meant to absorb my sorrow. During our initial sessions, she was the epitome of clinical empathy. Her face a carefully composed mask of concern, her voice a low, soothing murmur that offered textbook reassurances. She sat opposite me in the heavy silence of my study, a pen poised over a notepad, her presence feeling both necessary and like a profound intrusion into the sanctity of my pain. I saw her not as a person, but as a tool I was meant to use to piece myself back together. Our first few meetings were a blur of structured weeping and methodical storytelling. I would recount the story of how we met, the details of our wedding, the small, mundane moments that now felt like sacred artifacts. She would listen intently, nodding at the appropriate times, her pen scratching quietly as she cataloged the architecture of my loss. The process felt artificial, like I was performing my grief for an audience of one. The tears were real, the agony was visceral, but her professional detachment created a chasm between us, making me feel as if my heartbreak was just another case file to be analyzed and archived. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A therapy session ran late, bleeding into the evening, and the encroaching darkness seemed to dissolve the formal boundary between us. Instead of leaving, she offered to make tea, moving about my kitchen with an unnerving confidence. We sat not in the formal study, but at the small kitchen table where my wife and I had shared so many morning coffees. The conversation drifted away from structured therapeutic prompts into a more natural human exchange. It was the first time I saw a flicker of something beyond the professional mask, a genuine curiosity that was both disarming and unsettling. Soon, the pretense of formal sessions was abandoned altogether. She would arrive in the late afternoon, and our time together would stretch into the evening, filled with quiet companionship that slowly began to fill the cavernous emptiness of the house. The silence, once a crushing weight, became a shared space between us. Her presence was a low hum in the background of my days, a steadying force against the unpredictable waves of grief. She was a constant, a warmth that I began to crave with a desperate, unspoken need, even as a part of me recoiled from the dependency. The true turning point came when we began the heart-wrenching task of sorting through my wife's belongings. I had been unable to touch her closet, a shrine of silk blouses, cashmere sweaters, and the faint, lingering scent of her perfume. The consultant approached the task not with clinical detachment, but with a strange and gentle reverence. She held the fabrics as if they were precious relics, her fingers tracing the seams with a tenderness that caught me off guard. Her touch on my wife's clothes felt proprietary, an act of intimacy that she had not earned, and it planted the first bitter seed of a jealousy I couldn't yet name. I found her one afternoon in the doorway of our bedroom, a space she had not yet entered without me. She stood before my wife's vanity, her back to me, holding the crystal bottle of perfume that I kept exactly where my wife had left it. She had sprayed a small amount onto her own wrist and was holding it to her nose, her eyes closed in a state of sensory absorption, almost a trance. She was not just smelling a fragrance, she was inhaling a memory, trying to consume a piece of my wife's essence. The sight sent a shockwave through me, a surge of raw, protective fury that was as sharp and unexpected as a physical blow. This jealousy was a complex, twisted thing. It wasn't the simple envy of a potential rival, for there was no one to be rivalrous with. It was a violation of something sacred, an ownership of my past being usurped. She was a stranger laying claim to the intimate details of my life, not through shared experience, but through a kind of secondhand osmosis. My memories felt tangible, like physical objects she was handling without permission. I felt an irrational rage at her attempt to understand my wife, as if that understanding was a finite resource that she was stealing from me. Her presence began to colonize the house in small, insidious ways. A novel she was reading appeared on the coffee table, its spine cracked. She started leaving a specific mug, one my wife had never used, on the drying rack by the sink. Each of these small objects was a territorial marker, an assertion of her existence within the shrine I had so carefully preserved. The home was no longer just a monument to my wife. It was becoming a shared space, and the two realities were clashing in a silent, undeclared war for dominance within its walls. I began to watch her more closely, trying to decipher the true nature of her intentions. The professional empathy in her eyes was now mixed with something else, a deep and unsettling fascination. When I spoke of my wife, she would lean forward, her gaze intense, her questions becoming more personal and granular. It felt less like therapy and more like an interrogation, as if she were a historian trying to reconstruct a life, not to heal me, but to possess the knowledge for herself. She wasn't just learning about my wife, she seemed to be studying her, memorizing her, and I could not fathom why. This created a battlefield inside of me. The comfort she provided was an undeniable addiction, a soothing balm on the raw, open wound of my loneliness. I had come to depend on her quiet presence, on the simple fact of another beating heart in the house. But this comfort was locked in a desperate struggle with the growing unease, the possessive jealousy that coiled in my gut every time she touched one of my wife's possessions or asked a question that felt too intimate. The person hired to be my guide was becoming the focus of my confusion, blurring the line between healer and intruder until I could no longer tell them apart. The evening it all fractured was heralded by rain. It began as a soft patter against the window panes, a gentle, melancholic rhythm that soon swelled into a relentless downpour, mirroring the storm that was gathering inside of me. The grief, which I had managed to keep at a manageable distance for days, suddenly surged with the force of a tidal wave, pulling me under. It was a physical assault, a crushing weight on my chest that stole the air from my lungs and buckled my knees. I found myself on the living room floor, curled into a tight ball, the rough texture of the wool rug scratching against my cheek as racking, soundless sobs tore through my body. The consultant was there, preparing to leave, her coat already in her hands. She froze in the doorway, her professional composure momentarily faltering as she witnessed the raw, unfiltered totality of my collapse. For a long moment, she simply stood there, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. Then, with a quiet decisiveness, she placed her coat back on the chair, crossed the room, and lowered herself to the floor beside me. She didn't speak, didn't offer the empty platitudes her training had surely provided. She simply entered the space of my suffering and remained. Her embrace began as a tentative, careful gesture, a hand placed gently on my shaking shoulder. But as my sobs continued unabated, the gesture deepened into something more solid, more encompassing. She wrapped her arms around me, pulling my trembling frame against her, offering a warmth that felt like the first real heat I had felt in months. It was the solid, grounding presence of another human being, a stark contrast to the ghostly memories I had been clinging to. Slowly, a new sensation began to seep through the icy grip of my sorrow, the simple, undeniable reality of her body against mine. I don't know how long we stayed like that, a tangle of limbs on the floor as the storm raged both outside and within me. But at some point, the nature of the embrace shifted. The desperation of my grief met the steady warmth of her body, and the chemistry between them created something new and volatile. I lifted my head from her shoulder, my face tear-streaked and raw, and my eyes met hers. In the dim light, I saw the mask of the professional completely gone, replaced by an expression of profound, unguarded intensity. It was a look of shared vulnerability, an unspoken acknowledgement that a line was about to be crossed. With a resolve that came from a place beyond conscious thought, I reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cool, but they closed around mine with a firm, answering pressure. I rose to my feet, pulling her up with me, and without a word, I led her from the living room, down the familiar hallway, to the one room she had never entered. The door to our bedroom was closed, as it always was, a silent monument to a life that had ended. Pushing it open felt like breaking the seal on a tomb, and we stepped inside together into the still, fragrant air. The room was a sanctuary, perfectly preserved. Her clothes hung in the closet, her books were stacked on the nightstand, and the faint ghost of a scent, her perfume, a blend of jasmine and sandalwood, clung to the very air we breathed. I moved through the space as if in a dream, my actions guided by a new and terrifying instinct. I walked to the walk-in closet, my fingers brushing past rows of familiar fabrics until they found what they were looking for, a slip of black silk, a robe she had loved, which now felt as sacred as a shroud. I held it out to the consultant. It was not a suggestion. It was a command, an offering, a test. The silk shimmered in the low light, a piece of my past I was now placing in her hands. She looked from the robe to my face, her eyes wide with a dawning, perhaps horrified, understanding of what I was asking. For a moment, she hesitated, her hand hovering in the space between us. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt both like a surrender and a choice, she took the robe from my hands. She turned away from me, affording me a small, almost meaningless privacy as she unbuttoned her crisp, professional blouse and slipped out of her sensible trousers. I watched her reflection in the dark glass of the window, a pale shape moving in the gloom. Then she turned back, and in a single, fluid motion, she slipped her arms into the silk robe. The fabric, which had been molded to my wife's body, draped differently on her, clinging to unfamiliar curves. In that moment, she was transformed from the consultant into something else entirely, an understudy stepping into a role she was not prepared for. I stepped forward, closing the small distance between us, and my hands came up to touch the silk covering her shoulders. The fabric was cool and impossibly smooth beneath my trembling fingers. I was touching her, but I was feeling the ghost of my wife, and the collision of the two realities sent a tremor through my entire being. I leaned in, my face buried in the crook of her neck, and I inhaled deeply. There, on her skin, mixed with her own scent, was the jasmine and sandalwood I had desperately missed. She had not only put on the robe, she had somehow put on the scent, the memory itself. Our bodies came together not with the fire of passion, but with the desperate, aching gravity of two collapsing stars. It was a slow, almost reverent exploration, an act of profound and terrible substitution. My hands moved over the silk, memorizing the shape of the woman beneath it, while my mind superimposed the image of another. Every touch was a betrayal and a sacrament, a desecration of a memory, and a desperate attempt to make it breathe again. The cool, quiet bedroom became the stage for this strange, sorrowful theater where the living were used to animate the dead. The act itself was a quiet, desperate collision. It was a search for a familiar feeling in an unfamiliar body, a frantic attempt to find a ghost in a machine of flesh and blood. There was pleasure, a sharp and undeniable current that ran through the deep river of my grief, but it was a pleasure laced with the bitter taste of profanity. I was using her warmth, her life, as a conduit to a world I could no longer access. She was a vessel, and I was pouring all of my loss, my love, and my rage into her. In the aftermath, we lay tangled in the sheets, the silk robe a dark pool on the floor beside the bed. The rain had softened to a gentle drumming on the roof, and the only other sound was our breathing, ragged and uneven in the still air. Lying beside her, I felt a terrifying clarity. The act had not brought my wife back. It had not healed me. It had only hollowed out a new space inside of me, a place where my love and my grief had become twisted into something monstrous and unrecognizable. I had not found comfort. I had only found a more profound way to be haunted. Our connection became a secret, a strange and hermetic world contained entirely within the four walls of my house. The consultant no longer left in the evenings. Her departures became less frequent until they ceased altogether. Her car remained in the driveway, a silent testament to the unspoken contract that now bound us. The pretense of therapy had evaporated, leaving behind a relationship with no name, a cohabitation built on the shifting sands of my grief and her quiet, unnerving compliance. We existed in a bubble of our own making, shielded from the outside world, where the only rules that mattered were the ones I dictated. Her life began to bleed into the spaces that had once been so sacredly preserved. It started with small, almost unnoticeable things: a silver toothbrush appearing in the holder next to mine, a paperback novel with a creased spine left on the living room coffee table, a specific ceramic mug, one my wife had never favored, always left on the drying rack. Each object was a tiny flag of occupation, a subtle but persistent claim on the territory of my home. These were not the actions of a guest, but of an inhabitant, and each new item felt like a violation, a small crack in the perfect static monument I had built to my wife's memory. The ritual of our nights grew more specific, more theatrical. It was no longer enough for her to simply be there, a warm body in the cold bed. I began a meticulous reconstruction, a desperate and blasphemous art project where she was my canvas. I would select my wife's lingerie from the drawer, the cool slip of lace, the soft caress of silk, and ask her to wear it. This was not about seduction. It was about appropriation. I was dressing her in the armor of my memory, forcing her form into the shape of my loss, compelling her to become a ghost. I insisted she use my wife's perfume, the cloying scent of jasmine and sandalwood that clung to everything in our bedroom. Before she came to bed, I would watch as she sprayed the fragrance onto her skin, the scent enveloping her, masking her own. It was an act of erasure, a sensory baptism that washed away her identity and anointed her as a surrogate. The eroticism of our encounters became secondary to the performance, each touch and kiss a carefully choreographed step in a dance with the dead, where she was my silent, living partner. In the darkness, I began to whisper my wife's name. I would say it at the peak of our intimacy, a necromantic incantation meant to conjure a spirit into the flesh I was holding. The first time I did it, I felt a visible flinch, a brief stiffening in the body beneath mine, a flicker of resistance from the person I was trying to extinguish. But she never pulled away, never protested. Her capitulation was absolute, and with each utterance of the name, she seemed to recede further, becoming less herself and more the echo I demanded her to be. I ceased to see her as a woman with her own thoughts or history. She became a beautiful, animate vessel, a living doll onto which I could project my desires and my sorrow. There was a terrible power in it, a sense of control that was intoxicating. I had lost my wife to the chaos of the world, but here, in this house, I could control this substitute, mold her, command her. My grief had not lessened, it had simply mutated, transforming from a passive state of suffering into an active, creative, and monstrous force. The discovery was mundane in its beginning. I was looking for a pen in her handbag, which she had carelessly left on a chair in the study. My fingers brushed against not a wallet, but the smooth, glossy edge of a photograph. Curiosity, cold and sharp, pierced through my self-absorption. I pulled it out. The photograph was not of her, not entirely. It depicted her on a sunlit beach, her arm wrapped tightly around another woman, their faces pressed together, their smiles genuine and unburdened by the gothic gloom of my home. The woman in the picture was a stranger, but the emotion was not. It was a photograph of a life, a happy, normal, and complete life that existed entirely outside of me and my tragedy. It was proof of a past, of other loves, of a world where the consultant was not a vessel for my grief, but the center of her own story. This single, silent image was a rebellion. It was an assertion of an identity I had worked so meticulously to erase, a declaration that she was more than just the reflection of my dead wife. A cold fury, unlike any I had ever known, seized me. It was not the sting of romantic betrayal, for she had not betrayed me. She had betrayed the role I had assigned her. It was the rage of a creator whose clay had dared to have a life of its own before it was molded. It was the fury of a director discovering her lead actress had a whole other script she was secretly living by. Her crime was not infidelity. Her crime was her own personhood, her own history intruding upon the sacred, sterile space of my obsession. I didn't scream or accuse. I simply walked back to the bedroom where she was reading and held the photograph out to her. I watched her face as she saw it in my hand, saw the cascade of emotions, shock, then a deep, visceral shame, followed by a flicker of pain so profound it was almost beautiful. She understood immediately what she had done wrong. Her transgression was not in having a past, but in failing to keep it hidden, in allowing its evidence to contaminate the pure, focused environment of my mourning. My accusation, when it came, was not about the other woman. It was about her impurity. I accused her of bringing the outside world into our sanctuary, of tainting the memory of my wife with the ghost of her own attachments. I made her feel as if her own happiness, captured in that sunny photograph, was a dirty secret that had desecrated our temple of grief. I watched the light in her eyes dim, watched her fold in on herself under the weight of my cold, righteous anger. She did not fight back or defend herself. She simply took the photograph from my hand and, without a word, tore it into small pieces, letting them fall like confetti onto the dark wood floor. In that act of destruction, she was not just destroying a picture, she was sacrificing her past on the altar of my present. In her eyes, I saw the death of that other woman from the photograph, and I knew she now understood the terms of our arrangement completely. She was mine, not as a lover, but as a ghost, and she had no life but the one I gave her. The anniversary of our wedding arrived on a Tuesday, carried in on a wave of cold, clear air. I spent the entire day preparing the bedroom, transforming it from a place of sleep into a consecrated space, a stage for the evening's final performance. I arranged dozens of beeswax candles on every available surface, their faint, sweet scent mingling with the roses I had placed on the nightstand. I put on the record we had listened to that night, a melancholy cello suite whose low, resonant notes seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the house. This was not an act of remembrance. It was an act of meticulous reconstruction, a desperate attempt to bend time and reality to my will. I had saved the dress for this moment. It was her favorite, a simple column of black silk that clung to the body like a second skin. I took it from its protective garment bag, the fabric cool and heavy in my hands, carrying the ghost of her scent even after all this time. I laid it on the bed and waited for the consultant to emerge from the bathroom. When she did, I held it out to her, and she took it without a word, her eyes dark with an understanding that went far beyond our unspoken arrangement. I watched her dress, my fingers working the delicate zipper up her back with the dispassionate focus of a museum curator preparing a priceless artifact for display. In the wavering light of the candles, the illusion began to solidify. I posed her by the window, the black silk a stark contrast to her pale skin, the mournful cello music wrapping around us like a shroud. In that moment, her own features, the specific curve of her mouth and the shape of her eyes began to blur. The boundaries of her form seemed to soften, and she became a silhouette, a perfect, empty vessel into which I could pour all my memories, all my longing. She was no longer the consultant. She was an effigy, a living statue I had clothed in my past. Our lovemaking that night was not an act of passion, but a solemn, ceremonial rite. Each movement was measured, a verse in a silent prayer aimed at the veil between worlds. I moved with a slow, deliberate reverence, my hands treating her body not as a source of pleasure, but as a sacred instrument through which I might channel a spirit. The goal was not physical release, but a kind of transcendence, a final, desperate attempt to breach the walls of death through the sheer, focused power of my own will, using her life force as the key. My eyes lifted to the large, silvered mirror on the wardrobe door, which reflected our entwined forms, flickering like a scene from an old film. I watched our movements, detached and analytical, searching the reflection for a sign, for a confirmation that my ritual was working. And then I saw it. For a breathtaking, impossible moment, the face looking back at me over my own shoulder was not hers. It was my wife's, her features perfectly rendered in the candlelight, her eyes full of a sad, familiar love, a knowing smile playing on her lips. And then, as quickly as it had formed, the vision fractured. The beloved face in the mirror dissolved, the features melting and reforming back into the pale, unfamiliar face of the consultant. The illusion shattered with the force of a physical blow, and the world rushed back in with a deafening roar. The cello music was suddenly grating, the candlelight harsh and interrogatory, the scent of roses cloying and funereal. I was not holding my wife. I was in bed with a stranger. A wave of revulsion, so cold and violent it felt like a physical sickness, washed over me. I recoiled from her as if I had been burned, scrambling away, untangling my limbs from hers with a frantic haste. The body that I had just held with such holy reverence now seemed grotesque, a profane effigy in a hallowed space. The black silk dress was no longer a sacred relic, but a costume on an impostor, a desecration of the memory it was meant to honor. She was a forgery, and her presence in my wife's bed was an unbearable blasphemy. The silence that fell was different from any that had come before. It was not the shared, complicit silence of our rituals, but a cold, vast emptiness. She sat up in the bed, pulling a sheet around herself, her face a mask of confusion and hurt. But I could no longer see her. All I could see was the terrible, undeniable truth of what I had done. I had not been communing with the dead. I had been defiling the living. Before me sat not a vessel for my love, but a stranger, a frightened woman dressed in a dead woman's clothes, and the sight of her was the most horrifying reflection of all. The morning arrived stripped of all illusion. The bedroom was cold, the candles nothing more than small waxy lumps, their wicks drowned in hardened pools. A profound and absolute silence had descended upon the house, an emptiness far more complete than the one my wife's death had left. The consultant was gone. On the bed, folded with a precision that felt both deliberate and accusatory, lay the black silk dress. It was a shed skin, a costume left behind after the play had reached its disastrous conclusion. Her suitcase was gone from the hall, her coat from the hook. There was no note, no final word, only the deafening void of her absence. The house felt sterilized, purged of the small, intrusive signs of her life that had accumulated over the weeks. The silver toothbrush was gone from its holder, the paperback novel from the coffee table, the specific ceramic mug from the dish rack. Their absence was now as loud and unsettling as their presence had been. I walked through the silent rooms, a ghost in my own home, tracing the empty spaces she had left behind. The house was once again a perfect shrine to my wife, but the purity of the monument was now corrupted, forever tainted by the memory of the living woman I had tried to turn into a ghost. The grief I had held at bay, the raw sorrow I had tried to transfigure through my elaborate rituals came crashing back. But it returned, changed, twisted into a new and more monstrous shape. It was no longer the clean, sharp pain of loss. It was a contaminated grief, poisoned by the shame of my actions, by the sickening realization of my own profanity. The memory of my wife was no longer a source of sorrowful comfort. It was now inextricably linked to the image of the consultant's horrified eyes, to the desecration I had performed in that very bed. I found myself standing in the dining room, the stage of our first silent contract. The table was still set as it always was, for 3 people who would never share a meal. My own setting, the empty one for my wife, and the one the consultant had occupied. The entire tableau now seemed grotesque, a monument to a madness that had failed. The ritual felt hollow, its power broken. The ghost of my wife felt impossibly distant, as if the crude physical reality of the consultant's living body had finally and irrevocably banished her spirit from the house. My gaze drifted from my wife's empty chair to the one where the consultant had sat, night after night, in perfect, silent compliance. A new thought, cold and clear, began to form in the ruins of my obsession. The ritual had failed because its object was intangible, a memory I could never fully grasp. But the consultant had been real. Her warmth, her submission, her fear, it had all been real. The grief and the rage and the bottomless need inside me did not vanish with my epiphany. They simply sought a new, more tangible vessel. My movements were slow, devoid of emotion, like a machine being reset. I walked to the table and picked up the plate, the wine glass, and the silverware from my wife's place setting. I carried them back to the kitchen, their purpose now obsolete, and washed them with a dispassionate thoroughness. The act was a quiet, final betrayal, an acknowledgement that the ghost I had worshipped for so long no longer held any power over me. The shrine was being decommissioned. Then I returned to the dining room, I did not remove the consultant's place setting. Instead, I went to the sideboard and took out a fresh napkin and a clean coffee cup, the specific ceramic mug she had always used. I prepared a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, placing it carefully on the placemat before her empty chair. I poured her a cup of coffee, the dark, rich aroma filling the silent room. I was not clearing the stage. I was resetting it for a new performance. I sat down at my own place, the food on my plate untouched, and looked at the two empty chairs before me. A terrifying calm settled over me, a sense of purpose that was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. The house was quiet, waiting. The raw, aching void inside me was no longer directed at the past. My grief had not been healed. It had simply found a new host. I was no longer waiting for the dead to return to me. I was waiting for the living so I could begin the ritual of making her a ghost all over again.